Some people don't belong on a stage until the stage remembers them. The music hadn't even fully started when she moved. A single step forward, quiet, controlled, like she had been waiting for this moment long before anyone else in the room even realized it existed. And the laughter that had filled the private gala just seconds ago began to fade, not all at once, but in pieces, like glasses being set down one by one as attention shifted. Because Emily Carter was no longer just the waitress holding a tray 15 seconds earlier, she was something else now. Something the room couldn't quite name yet, and Daniel Hayes felt it first. That subtle shift in air, the kind he was used to controlling, not reacting to. His fingers pausing around the rim of his crystal glass as his eyes narrowed, studying her like a problem he hadn't expected to solve tonight. Because this was supposed to be simple, a joke, a harmless dare to entertain his guests, something to prove that money could still bend a room to his will. And yet as Emily turned, the soft light catching the edge of her face, there was no hesitation, no awkwardness, no trace of someone performing for approval, only precision, only intention, and the first beat of the music landed as if it had been waiting for her cue, not the other way around. Her heels gliding across the polished marble floor with a confidence that didn't match her uniform, didn't match the assumptions everyone had made about her just moments ago, and the room, filled with executives, investors, people who measured value in numbers and deals and power, fell into a silence none of them had planned, because what they were watching didn't fit into any category they understood. It wasn't entertainment, it wasn't a trick, it was something closer to presence, something earned, something that couldn't be bought or requested or dared into existence. And Daniel felt it again, sharper this time. That unfamiliar sensation of losing control of a moment he had created, his smirk fading not out of embarrassment but confusion, because she wasn't reacting to him at all. She wasn't dancing for him. She wasn't even acknowledging him anymore. As if his challenge had simply opened a door she had already decided to walk through on her own terms. And as she spun, the movement, clean, effortless, almost surgical in its precision, a quiet murmur moved through the crowd, subtle at first, then growing, a shift in posture, in breathing, in attention, and somewhere behind Daniel, a voice, barely above a whisper, said a name that didn't belong to a waitress, a name that carried weight, history, something buried, something forgotten. And Daniel's grip tightened slightly around his glass as his eyes locked onto her again, really seeing her for the first time, not the uniform, not the role, but the person standing in front of him. And for a brief second, something in his expression cracked, not fully, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for him to feel it, because deep down, beneath the wealth, beneath the control, beneath the certainty that he could read any room, he realized something he hadn't prepared for, something no amount of money could fix in real time. That this wasn't a performance he had initiated, this was a story already in motion, and he had just stepped into it without understanding the rules. Daniel Hayes had built his entire life on reading people in under 10 seconds, but Emily Carter refused to be understood that quickly, and that was what unsettled him most as the music continued. Each movement she made rewriting the assumptions he had already formed, because nothing about her aligned with the role she had been standing in just minutes ago. Not the way she carried her weight, not the way her eyes stayed focused, somewhere beyond the crowd as if the room itself did not matter, and certainly not the way the audience, his audience, responded without being asked, leaning forward, holding their breath, forgetting their conversations, their deals, their carefully constructed appearances. And for the first time that evening, Daniel was no longer the center of attention, not by choice, not by strategy, but because something more compelling had taken its place, and he felt it in the subtle shift of power, quiet, but undeniable, as if the entire room had agreed on something without speaking, that this moment belonged to her, not to him. And somewhere behind the line of guests, an older man stepped closer, his expression tightening with recognition, his voice low but urgent as he spoke again, repeating that name, and this time it traveled, passed from one person to another in fragments. Incomplete, uncertain, but growing, and Daniel caught it now, not fully, not clearly, but enough to feel the implication, enough to understand that whatever this was, it had a past, and that past had nothing to do with serving tables or carrying trays. And as Emily turned once more, the music rising with her. There was a brief flicker in her expression, not hesitation, not fear, but memory, something deeper, something practiced long before tonight. And Daniel found himself searching for details he had missed earlier, the steadiness of her hands, the posture that never slouched, the quiet distance she maintained even while standing inches away from guests. Details that now felt less like coincidence and more like clues he had ignored, because they had not fit the narrative he preferred, and the realization pressed in slowly, uncomfortably, that he had not only underestimated her, he had misread the entire situation. And that was a mistake he rarely allowed himself to make. Yet here he was, watching as the final notes of the music approached, aware that whatever happened next would define how this moment ended, not just for her, but for him as well. And as the room held its breath, waiting for resolution, Daniel understood something he had not expected to learn tonight. That control was not always taken. Sometimes it was revealed, and right now, he was no longer the one holding it. The final note lingered in the air just a fraction longer than expected, and when it faded, Emily did not move right away. She simply stood there, still, composed, as if the silence itself was part of the performance. And for a moment no one dared to break it, not with applause, not with words, because something about what they had just witnessed demanded more than noise. It demanded recognition. And then it came, not loud at first, but rising, hands coming together slowly. Then all at once, the entire room shifting into a standing ovation that no one had planned and no one could stop. And Daniel Hayes remained seated for half a second too long, watching her as if trying to solve a puzzle that refused to give him an answer, before he finally stood as well, his expression no longer amused, no longer detached, but sharpened by something unfamiliar, something closer to respect than curiosity. And as the applause continued, Emily stepped back from the center of the floor, not basking in it, not reaching for it, simply letting it pass through the room as if it did not belong to her. And that was when Daniel noticed it again, that distance, that quiet refusal to claim what most people would have chased, and it unsettled him more than the performance itself, because it meant she had not done any of this for them, not for the crowd, not for the attention, and certainly not for him. And as she turned to leave the floor, returning toward the space where she had stood before, a few of the guests moved closer, drawn by recognition now, voices rising just enough to form questions, to confirm what they thought they had seen. And the older man who had spoken earlier stepped forward fully this time, his voice steady, certain, saying her name again, clearly now. And this time there was no mistaking it. The name carried history, reputation, something once known in rooms far more prestigious than this one, and Daniel felt it land, not as a fact, but as a realization that came too late, that he had not only underestimated her, he had interrupted something larger than his own moment. And as Emily paused briefly, acknowledging the man with a small, polite nod, nothing more, no explanation, no correction, Daniel took a step forward without fully deciding to, drawn by a need he could not quite define. And when she finally looked at him again, her expression was calm, unchanged, as if nothing about the past few minutes had altered her sense of self. And that was what struck him most, that while the entire room had shifted, she had not. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel chose his words carefully, not out of strategy, but out of respect. Yet before he could speak, she did, her voice quiet, steady, cutting through the fading applause without effort, saying only, "I believe you offered a tip." And there was no challenge in her tone, no sarcasm, only a simple acknowledgement of what had started this entire moment. And Daniel felt the weight of that sentence more than anything else she had done, because it forced him to confront the beginning, the careless assumption, the ease with which he had tried to define her. And for a brief second, he hesitated, not because he lacked the means, but because he understood that whatever he said next would reveal far more about him than it ever would about her. Daniel did not reach for his wallet immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed, because for a man like him, someone who had never needed to pause before making a financial decision, even a second of silence carried weight. And Emily watched him without pressure, without expectation, simply allowing the moment to unfold on its own terms. And that was what made it different, what made it impossible for him to respond the way he normally would, with ease, with control, with certainty, Because this was no longer about money. It had not been for a while now, and he understood that, finally, clearly, as the room quieted again, the applause fading into a low murmur, the attention shifting back to them, waiting, observing, measuring, and Daniel took a slow breath, setting his glass down with deliberate care, as if grounding himself in something familiar before stepping into unfamiliar territory. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but stripped of the earlier arrogance, the sharp edge softened by something more honest, more careful, saying that the offer still stood, but the tone had changed, not a command, not a dare, but an acknowledgement, and Emily tilted her head slightly, considering him, not impressed, not offended, simply present, and for a brief moment, the entire room seemed to fade behind them. The music, the lights, the quiet conversations reduced to background, because what mattered now was not the performance that had already happened, but what came after, what it revealed, and Daniel realized that whatever he said next would define not just this interaction, but how he saw himself in it, whether he remained the man who believed everything had a price, or whether he allowed this moment to challenge that belief. And so instead of reaching for money, he did something unexpected, something that surprised even him. He asked her a question, simple, direct, without strategy, asking who she was, not in the superficial sense, not the role she was playing tonight, but the person he had just seen, and Emily held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, as if deciding how much truth the moment deserved, and then she gave him an answer that did not fully answer the question, saying that she was someone who used to dance before life required something different, and there was no bitterness in her voice, no regret, only a quiet statement of fact, and Daniel felt that land differently than anything else she had said, because it suggested a choice, or perhaps a loss, something beyond his immediate understanding, and before he could ask more, before he could follow that thread, she reached for the tray she had set aside earlier, lifting it with the same steady hands, the same composed posture, as if nothing about the past few minutes had disrupted her purpose, and that contrast between what she had just done and what she was returning to struck him harder than the performance itself, because it revealed something he rarely encountered, someone who did not need the spotlight to validate their worth, someone who could step into it and step out of it without losing themselves. And as Emily turned slightly, preparing to continue her work, Daniel found himself standing there, aware that the moment was slipping away, that whatever he had been about to say might not matter anymore. And for the first time that evening, he understood that control was not about holding attention. It was about knowing when you no longer needed it. The sound of glassware and quiet conversation slowly returned, but something had changed, something subtle yet impossible to ignore, because even as Emily moved between tables, again, carrying plates, refilling water, responding with the same calm professionalism as before, the room no longer saw her the same way. And Daniel Hayes felt it in every glance that passed between guests, in every lowered voice, in the way attention lingered just a second longer when she stepped into view, as if everyone was trying to reconcile the image they had formed with the reality they had just witnessed. And Daniel remained where he stood for a moment longer than necessary, watching her not as a spectacle, but as a question he could not yet answer, because nothing about her behavior aligned with what most people would have done after a moment like that. There was no attempt to capitalize on it, no effort to draw attention back to herself, only a quiet return to work, and that, more than anything else, unsettled him, because it suggested a level of self-assurance he rarely encountered, the kind that did not depend on recognition. And as he finally moved back toward his table, the conversation around him began to shift, no longer centered on deals or numbers, but on her, fragments of speculation forming. Someone mentioning a performance they once saw years ago, another recalling a name from a program, and Daniel listened without appearing to, piecing together what little he could from incomplete memories and uncertain voices, until that same older man approached him directly, his expression measured, thoughtful, as if weighing whether Daniel deserved the information he was about to share. And when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had seen more than the rest of them, saying that Emily Carter was not just someone who used to dance. She was someone who had once been on stages that most people in that room had only paid to attend. Someone who had built a reputation on precision, on discipline, on a presence that could command attention without asking for it. and Daniel felt that settle into place, not as surprise, but as confirmation of something he had already sensed. And yet there was more, something in the man's tone that suggested the story did not end there, and Daniel asked, without pretense this time, what had happened, and the man paused, just briefly, before answering that sometimes talent is not enough when circumstances shift, that sometimes people step away not because they lose what they have, but because something else demands it, something more important, something that cannot be measured or replaced, and he did not elaborate further, leaving the statement open, incomplete, but heavy with implication, and Daniel found himself looking back across the room, searching for her again, not with curiosity now, but with a growing sense of respect, because he understood something he had missed earlier, that her silence, her restraint, the way she carried herself even after reclaiming the spotlight, was not accidental. It was chosen, and that choice required a kind of strength he could not replicate with money or influence. And as Emily paused briefly at another table, offering a small, polite smile to a guest who now looked at her differently, Daniel realized that the real shift had not happened on the dance floor. It had happened after, in the way she refused to let that moment define her. And for the first time that evening, he questioned not who she was, but who he had been before this moment began. Daniel did not return to his seat right away, and that alone was unusual, because he was a man who valued efficiency, who moved with purpose, who did not linger without reason. Yet now he stood near the edge of the room, watching Emily as she continued her work with the same quiet rhythm, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and the contrast between what he had witnessed and what he was seeing now refused to settle into something simple, because it challenged a belief he had carried for years, that people revealed their true value when placed under pressure. Yet Emily had done the opposite. She had revealed her value and then stepped away from it, leaving the pressure behind as if it had never mattered. And Daniel found himself replaying the moment in his mind, not the performance itself, but the stillness before it, the way she had paused, chosen, decided, and that decision now felt more significant than the outcome, because it suggested control at a level he rarely encountered, the kind that did not need validation. And as he finally took a step forward, closing the distance between them once more, he noticed something he had missed before, the small details that did not fit the narrative he had originally assigned to her, the precision in how she placed each glass, the consistency in her posture, the quiet awareness of everything happening around her, not reactive, but intentional. And when she sensed his presence again, she turned slightly, not surprised, not guarded, simply acknowledging him as she would any other guest. And that, more than anything, forced him to adjust his approach, because he understood now that whatever this was, it would not follow the patterns he was used to. And so he spoke differently, not with authority, not with assumption, but with something closer to curiosity, asking her why she chose to step back into something she had clearly mastered, even for a moment. And Emily considered the question, her expression thoughtful but calm, as if the answer had been with her for a long time, saying that sometimes people do not return to what they were for recognition, they return to remind themselves that they still can, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything else she could have said, because it stripped away the need for external validation entirely. And Daniel felt that shift settle deeper, challenging something fundamental in how he measured success, because everything in his world was built on visibility, on results that could be seen, counted, acknowledged. Yet here was someone who moved differently, someone who could step into excellence without needing to claim it. And as Emily picked up another tray, preparing to move to the next table, Daniel realized that whatever connection he thought he could create with money or opportunity would not apply here, because she was not lacking anything he could offer in the way he understood value. And for the first time in a long while, he faced a situation where influence did not guarantee outcome, where presence did not command attention. And as he watched her walk away again, blending seamlessly back into the rhythm of the room, Daniel understood something that did not come easily to him. That respect was not something he could demand in this moment. It was something he had to earn, and that process had already begun, not through what he had said, but through what he had finally chosen not to assume. The night continued, but it no longer felt the same, not to Daniel, because every movement in the room now carried a different weight. Every conversation felt slightly off balance, as if something invisible had shifted the center. of gravity, and he found himself noticing things he would have ignored before: the quiet confidence in people who did not speak loudly, the subtle way attention followed authenticity rather than status, and it all traced back to her, to a single moment that had disrupted the structure he relied on. And as he stood there, no longer trying to control the evening but simply observing it, he realized that the discomfort he felt was not loss. It was awareness, and that awareness was forcing him to reconsider something he had never questioned. That power did not always belong to the person who initiated the moment. Sometimes it belonged to the one who understood it, and Emily had understood it from the beginning, even before he spoke, even before the music started, and that realization settled into him slowly, not as defeat, but as something more valuable, something that could not be purchased or negotiated. And as he moved again, this time without urgency, he approached her once more, not because he needed an answer, but because he wanted to close the distance without assumptions. And when she turned to face him, her expression unchanged, steady, present, he noticed something new, not in her, but in himself: the absence of the need to impress, the absence of the need to lead the interaction. And for a brief moment, they stood there in a kind of quiet equilibrium, no longer defined by roles or expectations, just two people sharing a space that had already revealed more than either of them had planned. And Daniel spoke again. But this time there was no challenge in his voice, no underlying agenda, only a simple acknowledgement, saying that what she had done was remarkable, not as a compliment meant to flatter, but as a statement of fact. And Emily listened, her gaze steady. And then she responded in the same calm tone, saying that what mattered was not what she did, but why she did not stay. And that sentence lingered, because it shifted the focus entirely, away from performance, away from recognition, toward choice, toward intention. And Daniel felt that land deeper than anything else, because it pointed to something he had not yet considered: that the true measure of a person was not what they could do when given the spotlight, but what they chose to do when they had it. And as the music changed again in the background, softer now, less demanding, Emily glanced briefly toward the rest of the room, where guests had begun to return to their conversations, though with a different tone, a quieter energy, and then back to him. And in that moment, Daniel understood something without needing it explained: that whatever story had brought her here, whatever path had led from those stages to this floor, it was not defined by loss, it was defined by decision. And that decision carried a kind of strength he could not replicate, only recognize. And as she stepped past him, returning once more to her work, Daniel did not follow. He did not call her back. He simply watched, aware that the moment had already given him more than he expected, and that the only thing left to decide was whether he would carry that understanding forward or leave it behind, like every other passing impression he had once controlled. By the time the evening began to wind down, the room no longer resembled the one Daniel Hayes had walked into hours earlier, not because anything physical had changed, but because the atmosphere itself had shifted into something quieter, more reflective, as if every conversation now carried an unspoken awareness. And Daniel found himself standing near the window, looking out at the city lights stretching across the skyline, yet not really seeing them, because his thoughts remained anchored to a single moment, replaying not with confusion anymore, but with clarity. And he realized that what unsettled him was not that he had been wrong about Emily Carter, it was how easily he had been wrong, how quickly he had assigned value based on appearance, role, and context, assumptions that had served him well in business, but had failed him completely here. And as he turned back toward the room, his eyes searched for her again, not out of curiosity this time, but out of intention, because there was something unfinished, not in what had happened, but in what it meant. And when he finally found her near the far side of the room, clearing a table with the same composed precision, he walked toward her without hesitation, not to reclaim control, but to acknowledge what had already been revealed. And when she looked up, meeting his gaze with that same calm presence, Daniel spoke with a steadiness that was new, even to him, saying that he had spent years believing he understood people, that he could read them, predict them, place them within a structure that made sense, and that tonight had shown him how limited that understanding truly was. And there was no performance in his words, no attempt to impress, only a quiet honesty that carried more weight than anything he had said before. and Emily listened without interrupting, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present. And when he finished, she did not respond immediately, instead taking a brief moment, as if measuring not his words, but the intention behind them. And then she spoke, her voice soft but clear, saying that understanding people is not about reading them quickly. It is about recognizing that some stories are not visible at first glance, and that those stories deserve time, not judgment. And Daniel felt that settle into him, not as a correction, but as a shift in perspective, something that would not disappear once the night ended. And as the last of the guests began to gather their coats, preparing to leave, the room gradually returning to its original rhythm, Emily picked up her tray once more, ready to continue until the evening was fully complete, and Daniel stepped back slightly, not because he had nothing left to say, but because he understood that the moment did not require more words. It required space. And as she moved past him, blending once again into the quiet flow of the room, he realized that what had happened tonight was not a loss of control. It was the beginning of a different kind of awareness, one that could not be undone. And as he stood there, watching her disappear into the rhythm of her work, Daniel understood something that would stay with him long after the lights went out. That the most powerful moments are not the ones you create, but the ones that change you. When you least expect it, the last guest left just after midnight. The soft echo of closing doors and fading footsteps marking the end of an evening that had begun like any other and ended with something no one in that room would easily forget. And as the staff moved quietly through the space, clearing tables, resetting chairs, returning everything to its original order, Emily Carter worked with the same steady rhythm she had carried all night, no faster, no slower, as if the moment on the dance floor had not altered her pace at all, and Daniel Hayes remained a little longer than necessary, not because he needed to, but because leaving too quickly felt like walking away from something unfinished. And as he finally approached her one last time, there was no urgency in his step, no expectation in his posture, only a quiet intention to close the night with the same honesty it had forced him to discover. And when she looked up, meeting his gaze again, the room around them now nearly empty, he did not begin with an offer or a question. He began with something simpler, something that carried more weight than anything he had said before, saying thank you, not for the performance, not for the moment itself, but for what it had revealed. And Emily listened, her expression calm, her presence unchanged, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something softer in her eyes, not approval, not validation, but acknowledgement. And she nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried its own kind of closure. And as Daniel reached into his jacket, he paused again, not out of hesitation this time, but out of understanding. And instead of placing money on the table, he set down something else, a simple business card, not pushed forward, not emphasized, just left there as an option, not a transaction. And he spoke quietly, saying that if she ever chose to return to a stage, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to, there were people who would remember, people who would listen, and there was no pressure in his words, no expectation of a response, only an open door offered without condition. And Emily glanced at the card briefly, then back at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence itself held everything that needed to be understood. And then she gave a small, composed smile, the kind that did not promise anything, but did not dismiss it either, and said that sometimes the right moment is not about returning, it is about choosing when. And Daniel accepted that without question, because he understood now that timing, like respect, could not be forced. And as he turned to leave, stepping out into the cool night air where the city moved on as if nothing had changed, he realized that something had, not in the world around him, but in the way he would move through it from now on. And inside, Emily picked up the card, not with urgency, not with excitement, but with quiet consideration, placing it carefully into her apron pocket before continuing her work, because some opportunities are not meant to interrupt your path. They are meant to wait until you decide to take them. And as the lights dimmed and the room finally settled into stillness, the echo of the night remained, not in applause, not in memory alone, but in a simple truth that neither of them would forget, that dignity does not ask for attention. It changes the room when it arrives, and leaves just as quietly when it is done.